The autumn wind swept across the sprawling grounds of Ashworth Manor, carrying with it the scent of rain-soaked earth and fallen leaves. Eleanor stood at the iron gates, her leather trunk beside her, watching the grand mansion emerge from the morning mist, like something from a dream she couldn't quite remember. The main house rose 3 stories into the grey sky, its pale stone facade gleaming despite the weather. Manicured lawns stretched out on either side, bordered by ancient oaks that had probably stood for centuries. She had been hired 6 months ago through correspondence with the estate manager, cook, housekeeper, caretaker. Her duties were extensive, though the salary had been generous enough to make her leave her small life in Boston behind. What Eleanor hadn't expected was the feeling of stepping into another world entirely. The servants' quarters were located in the eastern wing, and she had been given a modest but clean room on the 2nd floor. A window overlooked the gardens, and from it she could see the stable, the workshop, and beyond that, the village in the distance. The household staff was small but efficient. Mrs. Hartwell, the head housekeeper, was a woman in her 60s with iron-grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. She had shown Eleanor around with minimal conversation, speaking only when necessary to point out where things were stored or which tasks fell under Eleanor's responsibility. There was also Thomas, the groundskeeper, James, the stable master, and cook herself, a rotund woman named Margaret who seemed to exist primarily in her kitchen. It was on Eleanor's 3rd day that the Duke arrived. She was in the garden, pruning dead roses from the beds near the house, when she heard the commotion. Horses' hooves on gravel, the shouting of men, the rattling of what must have been an expensive carriage. Eleanor straightened, her pruning shears in hand, and watched as the vehicle came to rest before the main entrance. She should have gone inside, should have made herself invisible as a servant was meant to do, but something about the moment held her in place. The carriage door opened, and a man stepped down. He was tall, that much was immediately apparent. He moved with the kind of confidence that came from generations of privilege, his dark coat perfectly tailored to his frame. His hair was black as a raven's wing, somewhat unkempt, falling across his forehead. Even from a distance, Eleanor could see the sharp angles of his face, the jaw that seemed carved from stone. He was, in every measurable way, exactly what she would have expected a duke to be, imposing, remote, and utterly unapproachable. The servants rushed forward to greet him. Mrs. Hartwell appeared as if summoned by magic, her posture straightening to an almost rigid position. The Duke said something to her in a low voice. Eleanor couldn't hear the words, only the cadence of his speech. He spoke with an accent that wasn't quite English, though it carried that same refined quality. His pronunciation was precise, but with subtle variations in intonation that marked him as foreign-born. Eleanor realized she was staring and forced herself to look back at the roses. But her hands had stopped moving, the pruning shears hanging uselessly at her sides. She was so focused on not being caught watching that she didn't notice him until he was nearly upon her. "You are new," he said, and the shock of his voice so close made Eleanor spin around, nearly dropping her shears. She curtsied automatically, her mind scrambling to find the appropriate response. This close, she could see that his eyes were a startling grey-blue, the colour of storm clouds. There was something in them that wasn't quite like other men's eyes, a depth perhaps, or a sadness. He said something else, a longer phrase in what Eleanor now realized was French. The words flowed like music, rolling off his tongue with an ease that suggested he had been speaking the language since childhood. Eleanor's face flushed. She had studied French in school years ago, but it had been impractical in Boston, and her knowledge had faded. I'm sorry, sir," she managed. "I don't speak French very well." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or disappointment. He studied her for a moment longer, as if trying to decipher something written in a language he couldn't quite read. Then he nodded, as if making a decision, and turned back toward the house. Before disappearing inside, he glanced over his shoulder at her. his gaze lingering just long enough to make her heart skip an irregular beat. Eleanor stood among the roses, her hands trembling slightly. She had no idea what he had said to her or why he had sought her out at all. But as she watched the empty space where he had been, she felt something shift inside her, a recognition perhaps, or the beginning of a story that neither of them had chosen, but both would be forced to tell. That night, Eleanor lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to understand the feeling that had bloomed in her chest. It made no sense. He was a duke, and she was a servant. He was foreign, and she spoke no French. He was probably passing through, and she would likely never exchange another word with him as long as she lived. Yet somehow, in that moment among the roses, she had felt seen in a way that had nothing to do with language, and everything to do with something deeper, something that existed beyond words entirely. The Duke's name was Adrian Leclerc, and he had inherited Ashworth Manor 3 years ago from an English distant relation he had never met. He had spent most of that time in Europe, attending to his other estates and the complicated business of managing vast wealth. He had returned to England now because there was work to be done, repairs to be made, accounts to be settled, decisions that required his presence rather than his correspondence. What he had not expected was to be as restless as he found himself on the morning after his arrival. Adrian stood in his study, looking out the window toward the gardens where he had encountered the woman with the pruning shears. Eleanor, he had learned her name from Mrs. Hartwell, was English or perhaps American, though her accent suggested she might have ties to Boston. She was not particularly beautiful, though there was something about the line of her face, the way she held herself, that suggested resilience. She was slender, perhaps too much so, and her hands were stained with soil and work. He should not have approached her. It was not the custom for a duke to concern himself with a servant, and certainly not to attempt conversation. But Adrian had spent 3 years in isolation, surrounded by the complex geometry of European politics and business. He'd forgotten what it was like to simply exist in another person's presence without calculation or strategy. When he had seen her standing among the roses, there had been something almost desperate in his need to acknowledge her existence. He'd spoken to her in French because it was his first language, the one that came most naturally when he was not thinking carefully about his words. The disappointment on her face when she admitted she didn't speak it had been sharp and immediate. She was ashamed, he realized, of not understanding him, and in that shame he had seen an opportunity. Adrian began spending more time in the gardens. It started simply a walk after breakfast, ostensibly to inspect the grounds and note what repairs were needed. Eleanor was always there somewhere, tending to the beds or pruning branches or pulling weeds. They would see each other, and he would nod, and she would curtsy, and nothing was said. But there was a rhythm to these encounters, a choreography that neither of them controlled, but both seemed to understand. One morning, 3 weeks after his arrival, Adrian stopped near where she was working and simply stood watching her. The day was cold, and her breath came in small clouds of mist. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, and there was a small furrow of concentration between her brows. "Beautiful," he said in English, the word coming slowly. He had spoken so little English since his childhood that it felt clumsy on his tongue. Eleanor looked up, startled. "I beg your pardon." "The roses. You make them more beautiful." She blushed at the compliment, color rising in her cheeks. "Thank you, sir. They're doing well this year, despite the cold." They spoke haltingly, like people learning to walk after an illness. Adrian's English was grammatically correct but stiff, and he sometimes paused to find the right word. Eleanor, for her part, spoke carefully, as if afraid he might not understand rapid speech. Yet something passed between them in those silences, in the spaces between words. It was not language exactly, but something else, a kind of understanding that required no translation. Days turned into weeks. They began to meet more deliberately. Eleanor would be in the gardens in the late afternoon, ostensibly doing her work, but really waiting for him. Adrian would appear with some excuse. He needed to check the irrigation system, or perhaps assess the damage from the recent storm. They would stand together among the flowers and trees, occasionally exchanging sentences that were more fragments than complete thoughts. "Where you come from?" Adrian asked once, standing beside her as she worked. "Boston," Eleanor said. "It's a city in Massachusetts. Very old, very cold in winter." Adrian nodded slowly, processing the information. "Cold is good. Cold is honest. It tells you truth about the world." Eleanor looked at him, trying to understand what he meant. "Yes, I suppose that's true." On another afternoon, Eleanor asked, "How long will you stay?" Adrian was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought perhaps he hadn't understood the question. But then he said, "I do not know. Perhaps forever. Perhaps I leave tomorrow. There is nothing, how you say, no obligation." "That must be lonely," Eleanor said without thinking, then immediately regretted it. It was too familiar, too presumptuous. But Adrian simply looked at her with those storm-colored eyes and said, "Yes, it is very lonely, but less so now." Eleanor's heart performed an impossible acrobatic feat within her chest. She turned her attention back to the roses with more intensity than they deserved, afraid that if she looked at him much longer, she might say something that could not be unsaid. By the end of November, it was clear to anyone paying attention that something had changed between the Duke and the gardener. Mrs. Hartwell watched with narrowed eyes. Thomas made quiet comments to James about the nature of privilege, and yet neither Eleanor nor Adrian spoke of it, not directly. They were like two people learning a language that had no words for what they were becoming to each other. In the evenings, Eleanor would sit in her small room and attempt to teach herself French from a book she had purchased in the village. The grammar confused her, and the pronunciation seemed impossibly difficult, but she persisted. She wanted to understand him better, wanted to bridge the gap between them that seemed both impossibly wide and somehow already closed. Adrian, for his part, spent his evenings in the study, ostensibly reviewing the estate accounts. But mostly he stared out the window toward the servants' quarters and wondered what would happen if he allowed himself to close the distance that position and propriety demanded he maintain. The answer terrified him, which meant it must be something worth doing. December came early that year, arriving with a ferocity that took even the long-time residents of the estate by surprise. The first snow fell in early morning, transforming the gardens into a landscape of white and silver. By noon, the cold had become so intense that no one could work outside for more than a few minutes without risking frostbite. Adrian found Eleanor attempting to protect the winter herbs with burlap cloths. She was shaking with cold, her lips pale, her fingers clumsy with the numbing chill. "Come inside," he said, and it was not a request. Eleanor shook her head, still trying to tie off one corner of the cloth. "The plants will die if they're not protected, and Mr. Thomas has already had to nurse 2 workers through fever. I can manage." "You will die if you stay in this cold," Adrian said, his English stumbling slightly in his emotion. "Come now." He reached out and grasped her wrist gently but firmly, pulling her away from the herb garden. Eleanor made a token protest, but didn't actually resist. She was cold enough that the promise of warmth was overwhelming. Adrian led her, not to the servants' quarters, but to the main house, through a side entrance that brought them into a corridor Eleanor had never used. They came into a small library, where a fire burned in the hearth. It was a modest room compared to the grand formal rooms she had glimpsed in her time at the manor, but it was warm, and it was private. "Sit," Adrian said, pointing to a wing-backed chair near the fire. Eleanor sat, still shaking. Adrian disappeared and returned moments later with a thick wool blanket and a cup of hot tea. He draped the blanket over her shoulders and pressed the cup into her hands. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, cradling the warmth. Adrian settled himself in the chair across from her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Eleanor said, This is inappropriate. If anyone finds out, I do not care what is appropriate, Adrian said, each word careful and deliberate. I care only that you do not freeze to death tending roses. But your reputation, my reputation, Adrian said, and for the first time Eleanor heard something angry in his voice, something raw and barely contained. My reputation is already ruined. In France, I am the man who refused a duchess to marry for love. In England, I am the French interloper who bought his way into nobility. There is no reputation left to protect. Eleanor stared at him. You were supposed to marry a duchess. Adrian leaned back in his chair and studied the ceiling. When he began to speak, his English became even more halting, as if the memory required all his concentration to articulate. Her name was Margot, beautiful, elegant, from one of the oldest families in France. Our marriage was arranged when we were both children. It was understood that we would marry. No question, no possibility of refusal. But when I was 23, I met. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I met someone else, a woman without title, without fortune. She was a musician, and she played the violin like she was speaking to God. When I heard her play, I understood what it meant to be alive. Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest, but she said nothing, waiting for him to continue. I told my family I would not marry Margot. I said I would marry this woman, or I would not marry at all. They said I was a fool, that I was throwing away centuries of advantage and tradition for what? Passion? Love? These things, they said, were luxuries for people without responsibilities. Adrian finally looked at Eleanor, his storm-colored eyes heavy with emotion. But I did not care. I left France. I came to England. I bought an estate far from Paris. I thought here I would be free. What happened to the musician? Eleanor asked, though she was not sure she wanted to know the answer. She married someone else, Adrian said simply. Someone who could give her security. Someone who could give her a normal life. I saw her twice after she was married. She was happy, I think. Resigned, perhaps, but happy. I was alone in a new country, with more money than I could spend, and no reason to spend it on anything that mattered. Eleanor wanted to reach across the distance between them and touch his hand, but she didn't dare. You're not alone now, she said quietly. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I know. That is why I am terrified. The moment stretched between them, full of all the things neither of them had yet said. Then a sound from the hallway broke the spell, and Eleanor sat up straighter in her chair, and Adrian moved back to a more proper distance. You should go, Adrian said reluctantly, before someone notices you are gone. Eleanor stood, still wrapped in the blanket. She handed him back the teacup. As she did, their fingers brushed, and for just an instant neither of them pulled away. Then Eleanor stepped back. Thank you, she said, for the tea, for, she gestured vaguely around the room, for caring that I would freeze. I care about many things, Adrian said in French, forgetting that she would not understand him, but Eleanor heard the meaning in his tone anyway, and she did not ask him to translate. That night, Eleanor lay in her bed and listened to the wind howl outside her window. She thought about the musician in France, about Adrian's family and their disappointment, about the burden of privilege and the strange ways that love could complicate a life that was already difficult. She thought about how two people could be separated by an entire ocean of words they didn't share, and yet somehow be completely understood. The new year came and went without much ceremony at Ashworth Manor. Adrian and Eleanor continued their careful dance, speaking in fragmented sentences, their conversations interrupted by long silences that meant more than words ever could. They were not lovers, not in any physical sense, but neither were they simply employer and employee. They occupied some undefined space between, a territory that society had no name for and therefore no rules to govern. January was bitter and unforgiving. The cold deepened until even the hardiest plants retreated underground. Eleanor found less and less reason to be outside, which meant fewer reasons to see Adrian. They began to pass notes, Simple, carefully worded messages that Eleanor left in the garden shed, that Adrian would collect and answer. They were innocuous enough on the surface, discussions of plant care, observations about the weather, but underneath was another conversation entirely, one conducted in the spaces between the written words. It was Margaret, the cook, who first voiced what everyone already knew. She found Eleanor in the pantry one afternoon and said, without preamble, "You're going to get hurt, you know. A man like that doesn't stay with a woman like you. It's not in the nature of things." Eleanor's hands went still on the butter churn. "It's not like that," she said, though even to her own ears the denial sounded weak. "Isn't it?" Margaret asked, not unkindly. "I've seen the way he looks at you, and I've seen the way you look at him. It's a dangerous thing, that kind of looking. It makes promises that can't be kept." "He hasn't promised me anything," Eleanor said quietly. "That's what makes it more dangerous, not less," Margaret replied, and left Eleanor alone with her thoughts and the butter churn. But as winter deepened and February approached, something shifted. Adrian began to spend less time in the study and more time with Eleanor. They would meet in odd places, the abandoned greenhouse, the storage room, the library, when he knew Mrs. Hartwell would be occupied elsewhere. They didn't touch, not really, but they stood close enough that Eleanor could feel the warmth radiating from his body. One evening, Adrian brought a book to their meeting in the library. "French," he said, showing her the title. "Easy French, for you to learn." Eleanor took the book, touched by the gesture. "Thank you. I teach you," Adrian said. He was clearly working to form the sentence carefully. "You teach me your accent of English. We meet every evening, yes?" Eleanor nodded. "Yes." And so began the lessons. They met at 7 o'clock, after the household was settled for the evening, but before the servants retired. Adrian would bring tea and biscuits, contraband from Margaret's kitchen, though the cook never said anything, and they would sit by the fire in the small library. Eleanor would read from the French book, struggling over pronunciation, while Adrian gently corrected her. Then he would read to her in English, his voice careful and deliberate, and she would follow along, occasionally offering suggestions for better phrasing. But the lessons were really just an excuse to be together, to exist in proximity without the weight of suspicion. The French words and English sentences were secondary to the real conversation, the one that happened in glances and silences, and the careful way Adrian would adjust the book so that Eleanor could see the page more easily. "Why do you want to learn French?" Adrian asked one evening, about 3 weeks into the lessons. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Because it's your language, because the things you most want to say, you say in French. I want to understand you without—" She trailed off, searching for words. "Without the struggle." Adrian set down his book carefully. "You understand me," he said, and though his English was accented and sometimes imprecise, his meaning was absolute. "Without words, you understand me. More than my family understands, more than anyone in France understands." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "What happens after winter?" she asked. "When spring comes, and you leave?" "Why do you think I will leave?" Adrian asked. "Because men like you don't stay in places like this. Because this is temporary, and we both know it." Adrian stood and moved to the window. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, silent and relentless. "I have been running since I left France," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have been running from disappointment, from duty, from the weight of expectations I could not meet. I came to this country to escape, but what I found instead was—" He turned back to face her. "You." Eleanor stood too, drawn to him by something she couldn't name. "I cannot offer you what a woman should be offered," Adrian continued. "I cannot marry you, not here, not now. The scandal would destroy you, and I have already learned that loving someone means wanting their happiness more than your own. But I can offer you truth. Every day I will choose to be here with you, because you make me believe that running is over, that I can, perhaps, Finally be still. That's not enough, Eleanor said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were a lie. It was enough. It was everything. I know, Adrian said. It is not fair, but it is what I have. Eleanor crossed the space between them, a distance that had seemed vast for months, but now felt impossibly small. And there, in the library, with the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls, she reached out and took his hand. Not as a gesture of acceptance, not as an agreement to anything beyond this moment, but simply as an acknowledgement of what was. Two people, separated by language and status and expectation, who had somehow found a way to speak to each other's hearts. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in white, making everything blank and new. And in that blank space, in that white silence, they stood together, Eleanor with her limited French and her practical English, Adrian with his careful words and his heart laid bare. They understood each other perfectly, though neither could say exactly how or why. The words didn't matter anymore. The language they had been searching for all along existed in the spaces between sound, in the recognition of one wounded soul by another, in the decision to stop running and face whatever came next. And though Eleanor couldn't understand the French words Adrian whispered, as he finally drew her close, she understood their meaning completely. The Duke's heart was not a foreign country after all. It was, after all this time, simply home.